and welcome to Moms on Mics. I'm Joanne,
I'm Cash.
and this episode we are recording without Sophia.
Due to the contents of this episode, it is a very heavy and emotional episode. She just felt uncomfortable being in this episode. So to all the listeners, all the viewers, to all the listeners, this is very graphic and very heavy.
Okay, so this episode we continue our coverage on the West Memphis 3, and we are going to go through the autopsy reports for Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch. Gitchell initially told the press that the cause of death was trauma to the boy's head. It was stated a hammer or round object was used. However, that is not the case. The cause of death for two of the boys was drowning. Pam Hobbs and Melissa Byers state they didn't know how the boys were killed until trial, but Damien, Jason, and Jesse said they heard details about how the boys were killed around town. Now, if you remember, at the end of episode 2, I talked about how the police made the statement over the radio about that they had found the boys and what had happened, and they kind of went into detail. And then the press had heard what was stated on the radio, and they had released a statement the following morning. So when people claim that the only way that Damien and Jesse and Jason could have known what happened is if they were involved, that's not true. I think basically the parents, they didn't want to hear any of the information, which obviously I would not either. I would not, if this was my son, I would not be listening to the radio. I wouldn't be watching TV. I would be, I don't know, curled in a ball, unfunctioning.
My shit. That's what I would be.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not going to be watching for all the updates. You're not, that's just not. But for them to find out how they died in court, I don't know which way is better, really. It's horrific, whatever. So all 3 autopsies are done at Arkansas State Crime Laboratory, Medical Examiner Division by Dr. Frank J. Peretti, William Q. Sterner, Associate Medical Examiner, Chief Medical Examiner, Pathologist. Of record date of examination is May 7th, 1993. So this is going to be very technical. There's going to be a lot of words that we don't understand. A lot of parts of this that it might sound repetitive, and it's because it's the description of each individual boy. So this is for Stevie Branch. He was 8 years old, white male. Cause of death, multiple injuries with drowning. Manner of death, a homicide. External description. The body was that of a well-developed, well-nourished, nude white male. The body was covered with mud, leaves, and debris. The right hand was bound to the right ankle with a black shoelace. The left hand was bound to the left ankle with a white shoelace. Both hands and feet showed washerwoman wrinkling, which essentially means pruning, like when you're staying in water for too long. The body weighed 65 pounds and was 50 inches in height and appeared compatible with the reported age of 8 years old.
Now, I just had a question about before. Didn't they say it was only two centimeters or something of water?
No, it was
2 feet?
Yeah, it was just past their knees, right? Like just past the detective's knees. So the water was basically just deep enough for the bodies to be submerged. So you couldn't see, if you just glanced over the water, you couldn't see them. But it was also brown, dirty water, right? So, because it's not a fresh running stream or anything like that. It's a drainage ditch.
Right. I could have understood it wrong when I was reading it, because then I watched the movie and they said how tall it was. And I was like, wait.
Like it was just above their knees. So just above my knees is going to be a different height than just above your knees, right?
I was going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for some reason, I thought I read something about like 2 something.
I think it was 2 to 3 feet of water was basically what they're describing.
Okay, that makes sense. It's just, I could have read it wrong. That's all.
Well, it's also described differently in different reports and in different like YouTube videos or podcasts or the documentary series, right? And I think basically what happens is the confusion becomes from the depth of the water in different parts was different. right? So wasn't one unified part of water because it's a drainage ditch. So some parts it was really shallow, some parts it was deeper, but where the bodies were found was between 2 to 3 feet deep.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. The body was cold. Rigor was present and fixed to an equal degree in all extremities. Rigor as in rigor mortis, so the body stiffens, just in case anyone wasn't sure. Lividity, so the discoloration of the skin was present. Minimal and fixed on the anterior, posterior surfaces of the body. His body was cold and rigor mortis, so the stiffening that happens after death had fully set in. Lividity is the settling of blood after death. That was present but faint and fixed, meaning he had been in the same position for some time after death. There were multiple injuries situated on the body, which are described further below in detail. The scalp hair was blonde and bloody. The irides, so basically the irises of both eyes, were blue-gray. The cornea were clear. Bilateral transverse drying was present. The conjunctive sclerae were congested, so the whites of his eyes. There was one petechial hemorrhage involving the left sclera. Okay, so that means some drying of the eyes had occurred, which is normal after death. There was redness in the whites of his eyes and a small pinpoint hemorrhage, so a tiny burst blood vessel, which can sometimes be associated with trauma or pressure. The teeth were natural and in good condition. Examination of the neck revealed no evidence of injury. The chest and abdomen were unremarkable, except for the injuries to be described further below. The penis showed injuries as described below. The upper and lower extremities showed no abnormalities except for the injuries. The fingernails were short and intact. There was no evidence of breakage, and the nail beds were dirty. Injuries are described below. Posterior torso showed injuries as described below. A cloth friendship bracelet was present around the right wrist. Something to note about the boys were tied with their own shoelaces, so whoever did this used the materials on hand. And removing shoelaces takes time, especially from 6 shoes. You can't just pull on one end and they slide right out, right? Because they're crisscrossed in there. So,
But how do you know they were crisscross? Only because when I was a kid, I wore like those skater shoes that you just tie them around. I didn't crisscross my shoes.
what do you mean? No, like when you thread your shoelaces, though.
Yeah, I never did.
What do you mean? I have no idea. How did you put the shoelace into the shoe?
Because it was like the top of it, it was like a skater shoe at the time,
Yeah.
right? And it would go like around the top and then it would just go through a certain way. We never crisscrossed them. I have to find a picture to show you.
Yeah, because I don't understand how, like when you put a shoelace into the shoe, not when you're tying it, but when it's going into the shoe, it's right? If you don't crisscross it, how do you tie the shoe?
Because you would essentially just tie the shoe at the top where it'd come around. You do a little one and just tuck it in. I'll look and
But I feel like you're talking about crisscrossing it when you tie a shoe, though, right? Is that what you're saying?
no, there is actual times where like my laces were not crisscrossed.
Oh. Okay, well, I'm gonna guess most people, especially these guys, right? They're 8, so I would assume that the shoelaces are put in how everybody else puts their shoelace. I don't know. I guess it's just an assumption based on.
But I'm just saying too, kids will be kids, right? Like kids could not try opposite, right? They could try different things with their shoes as well.
Yeah, but I think I think that's more common for like preteen or teen, like, when you're like 10, 12. I feel like at 8, you still do things how you're supposed to because you've just learned it, right?
Well, mine's still wearing Velcro, so.
I don't know. I guess because there were shoes found at the scene, but they didn't have shoelaces. But I don't know.
That's why I just mean like to be detailed like that. Who's to say for sure if they matched a shoe to the thing, right?
I'm guessing though, like,
Because they've screwed up this case so much anyway.
oh, they have for sure. I just feel like, I mean, either way, I guess it doesn't really matter how the shoelace is put in, right? Either way, they had to take the shoelaces out to tie them.
Description of injuries. Head injuries. The right ear showed multiple confluent contusions and abrasions. Scattered abrasions were present over the right eye. A half-inch contusion was present in the right medial periorbital region. A 2-inch scratch was present below the right eye. Multiple scratches were present over the right mandible. Situated on the right mandible was a bell-shaped type abrasion, which showed a central area of pallor and abrasion. The lips were abraded with multiple superficial lacerations. The mucosal surfaces showed multiple contusions, lacerations, and hemorrhage. The gums were hemorrhagic. Extending above and below the left eyebrow was a bell-shaped patterned abrasion. The base measured 3/4 inch. The distance between the base and the dome was 1¼ inch. A 1/4 inch laceration was present immediately adjacent to the superior medial margin. The left parietal, which is the lobe of the brain, scalp showed multiple superficial cuts and abrasions. There were widespread abrasions, scrapes, cuts, and gouging wounds across the large area of the face, about 5½ by 5 inches. Also, some of these cuts were deep enough to go into the mouth. The entire left ear was contused with overlying finely linear abrasions. The entire left side of the face, to include the left ear and an area measuring 5½ by 5 inches, showed multiple confluent red abrasions with multiple gouging type irregular cutting wounds and an overlaying abrasions. The cutting wounds measured from 1/8 to 1¾ inches. Many of these wounds terminated into the oral cavity. The left occipital scalp was edematous and showed a contusion with overlying abrasions, measuring about 4 inches in greatest dimension. Subsequent examination of posterior neck muscles showed extravasated hemorrhage in the posterior neck muscles. Reflection of the scalp showed multifocal subgaleal contusions. There were no fractures noted to the calvarium. The base of the skull showed a 3½ inch fracture from multiple extension fractures which terminate in the foramen magnum, which measured 3½ inches. The left posterior cerebral hemisphere showed multifocal subarachnoid hemorrhage. There were fracture contusions involving the posterior surface of the left cerebellar hemisphere. The right frontal lobe showed focal subarachnoid hemorrhage. So, his left ear was also heavily bruised and scraped. Also, the left side of his scalp had multiple small cuts and scrapes. If you looked at the back of his head, there was swelling and bruising over a large area. Some of his neck and internal head injuries were bleeding in the muscles at the back of the neck, which could indicate trauma occurred while he was still alive. Also, under the scalp, there was multiple areas of bruising. Some of his skull and brain injuries were there was no fractures on the top of the skull, but there was a large fracture at the base of the skull, about 3½ inches, with additional cracks extending from it. This is a very serious and often fatal injury. There was also noted some bleeding in different parts of the brain, including the left side of the brain, the cerebellum, which controls balance and coordination, and the right frontal areas. Now, these types of brain injuries are consistent with significant blunt force trauma. In other words, a very forceful impact or repeated impacts to the head. In simple terms, this just means that the injuries show that he suffered extensive trauma to the head and face, especially on the left side. The presence of bleeding in tissues and the brain indicates that many of these injuries happened while he was still alive. Also, the fracture at the base of the skull and the brain bleeding point to a severe, likely brutal assault. So basically, the hemorrhaging means that he was alive when these wounds were made. And while some of the wounds are likely animal predation, the wounds to Stevie's head are the result of a brutal beating. While it's listed that his cause of death is multiple injuries and drowning, if he died in the water and the splashes heard by Ryan didn't happen till around 9:15 or so, why wasn't there any evidence of mosquito bites?
Those mosquito bites, man. If that one officer was saying that there were so many mosquitoes, she felt like she was breathing them in, there should have been mosquito bites on the boys' bodies, but there wasn't. Like if they were still alive at 9 when the splashes happened at 9:15 or so, they should have been covered in mosquito bites.
That's where I wonder if they were dumped there because you would think being in a forest with all the, like when you're out in the grass, right? They come
Yeah.
out in too.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess it is noted a lot that the mosquitoes kind of come out at night. Well, where we live, mosquitoes are around all the fucking time, right? So, yes, there are more of them around at night, but you still get mosquito bites during the day. I guess it would depend if it's really, really hot day. Maybe there's not as many out, and then they do wait until it's cooler at night. So I'm guessing that's maybe more why they're talking about at night, but I don't know. I think the mosquito bites are such an important factor, and it either leads to A, they were killed somewhere else and dumped there, like you said, or B, they were killed earlier. And they could only be killed so much earlier because of Dana Moore was the last one to see them around 6, right? But they could have been murdered shortly after that.
Well, and who's to say just because she saw them at 6 doesn't mean that they didn't come back out and she didn't see them either.
Yeah, but then if they came back out later, then they should have had the mosquito bites. Like if they came back out and went back into the woods later, they should have at that point have mosquito bites.
I never knew they went off of your breath, though. I always thought they went off your smell.
That's what I thought too, but
That's interesting.
because I wonder how the mosquito, like bug repellent, works then.
Right.
Or I guess maybe it just they land on you and they're like, ew, gross, and then fly away. Like maybe that's what it is, but it's interesting they don't bite something that is no longer alive.
Right.
So there's that. Chest injuries. Multiple scattered abrasions were present on the front of the chest. Genital anal area injuries. The anus was dilated. No injuries were noted. The anal and rectal mucosa showed mild hyperemia, but no evidence of injury. The mid shaft of the penis. So this, we have to remember, we are talking about Stevie Branch because there is one of the boys does have injuries to his penis, but this is not that one. The mid shaft of the penis, to include the glands, was diffusely red purple with overlying very fine superficial scratches. There was a clear brand of demacration at the mid shaft, which showed the proximal portion was uninvolved. There were no injuries noted to the testes or internal aspects of the scrotal sac. All right, so the genital anal area, like to simplify it a little bit. So the anus relaxed open, but there was no sign of injury. There was some mild redness inside the anal and rectal area, but again, no damage or trauma was found there, which likely leads to the absence of sexual assault. So the penis showed discoloration, so it was like red to purple along the middle to the tip with very small surface scratches. There was a clear line showing that only part of the area was affected while the rest was normal, and there was no injuries to the testicles or scrotum. These kind of markings, I would say, lead more to the animal predation situation going on there. So this wound would have occurred while he was still alive. Because of the bruising, your blood has to be pumping to cause a bruise, right? So this injury isn't really discussed in trial, which, I mean, I don't know why they didn't discuss it in trial, but yeah, if it occurred while he was still alive, then it definitely should have been brought up in trial, but it was not. So
I don't think a lot of it was brought up.
honestly, the trial, I will say both sides, I think, did a terrible job. The prosecution relied really heavily on ridiculous information rather than following the facts. And the defense attorneys, there's a lot of things they missed. There's a lot of things that they just let go. And then the whole trial was just, we'll get into it. Okay, so lower extremity injuries, multiple scratches and contusions were present on the lower extremities. On the left thigh, there was a 1 inch yellow scratch. There was a patterned grid-like impression. The margins were diagonally orientated and measured respectively 3 inches laterally and 3.5 inches medially. There was evidence of binding abrasions and contusions involving the ankles. The binding abrasions were yellow tan with arbored margins. There were multiple scratches and bruises on the legs, right? So on the left thigh, there was yellowish scratch, which can indicate it was starting to heal or slightly older. So that's less likely to have occurred during the attack. A patterned grid-like mark, which may have come from contact with a textured surface or object. And around the ankles, there were injuries consistent with being tied up, including scrapes and the bruising from the bindings. The upper extremity injuries on the back of the hands were multiple scattered contusions. Scattered contusions were also present on the thenar eminence bilaterally. Binding abrasions with surrounding red contusions were present on the wrists. So this means the backs of both hands had multiple bruises, and there was also bruises on the base of the thumbs and the fleshy part of the palm. The wrists showed clear signs of bindings, which, I mean, we know because they were tied up already, with scrapes and surrounding bruising consistent with being tied. Back injuries present over the left upper back were 2 contusions measuring approximately 2 inches and 1 by 1.5 inches. Terminal submersions, both hands and feet showed washwoman wrinkling. So again, that's like when you've been in the bathtub too long. There were pulmonary edema and congestion with blood frothy fluid in the airways. Bloody watery fluid was present in the sphenoid sinus. Okay, so that means that the hands and feet were heavily wrinkled, showing the prolonged exposure to water. The lungs were filled with fluid and swelling, and there was bloody, foamy fluid in the airways. There was also watery, bloody fluid in his sinus cavity, deep in the skull. Basically, these findings are consistent with drowning, meaning that the water was inhaled into the lungs. So, respiratory system, the upper and lower airways contained bloody, frothy material with a light amount of vomitus. The mucosal surfaces were smooth, yellow, tan, and unremarkable. The pleural surfaces were smooth, glistening, and unremarkable bilaterally. The pulmonary parenchyma was salmon pink, excluding slight to moderate amounts of blood and frothy fluid. No focal lesions were noted. The pulmonary arteries were normally developed, patent, and without thrombus or embolus. So the airways, the breathing passages, contained bloody foam and small amounts of vomit. The lungs showed fluid buildup and congestion and released bloody foamy liquid when examined. There were no blockages like clots or embolisms, and the lungs themselves didn't show disease, just the effects of the fluid inhalation. His opinion was this 8-year-old white male, Stevie Branch, died of multiple injuries with drowning. So manner of death, homicide, like we said. So basically what this means in easier to understand terms is there is clear evidence he was restrained, so tied up, at the wrists and ankles. He had multiple bruises and scrapes across his body, consistent with the trauma. The findings in the lungs and airways strongly indicate that he was breathing while in the water, meaning drowning played a role in his death. And some injuries, like the yellowish marks, may have occurred earlier than others, suggesting events happened over a period of time rather than all at once.
All right, the next one is James Michael Moore, age 8 years old, race white, sex male. Cause of death, multiple injuries with drowning. Manner of death, homicide. Description: the body was that of a well-developed, well-nourished, nude white male, whose hands were bound to the ankles in a hog-tied fashion. The body showed multiple injuries, which are described further below in greater detail. The body weighed 55 pounds and 49.5 inches in height, and appeared compatible with the reported age of 8 years. The body was cold. Rigor was present and fixed to an equal degree in all extremities. Lividity was present, minimal, and fixed on the posterior surface of the body, except in areas exposed to pressure. His body essentially was cold, and rigor mortis, which is the stiffening that happens after death, had fully set in. Lividity, which is also known as the settling of blood after death, was present but faint and fixed, meaning he had been in the same position for some time after death. The scalp was brown, wavy, and blood-soiled. The irises were green. The cornea were clear. The sclera, or the whites, and conjunctiva were slightly congested with no pectoral hemorrhages. So when we speak of the cornea being clear, all it means essentially is his eyes were green with some mild redness, but no pinpoint hemorrhages were seen. Fly larvae were present in the left periorbital region. When we speak of fly larvae, there was some larvae present near one eye, indicating that the body had been exposed to the environment for a bit of time. The teeth were natural and in good condition. The neck, chest, abdomen, and extremities were unremarkable, except for the injuries to be described below. The hands and feet showing washerwoman wrinkling. The posterior torso showed injuries as described below. A 1-inch birthmark is present over the left buttocks region. Description of injuries. The body was covered with scattered and focal areas of dried mud and debris. The hands and feet showed washerwoman wrinkling. The wrists were bound to the ankles bilaterally with black shoelaces. Removing of the binding showed the abraded and contused furrows present on both right and left ankles and wrists. A strand of fabric-like material was clenched in the left hand. Head injuries. Multiple punctate scratches were present over the bridge of the nose. The left ala, which is part of the nose, was abraded. The left side of the cheek was contused and edematous with an overlaying 1.5-inch contusion. The lips were abraded. The mucosal surfaces of the lips were contused, slightly edematous, with multiple superficial lacerations. The frenula were intact. Linear scratches were present on the left mandible region, along with a 3 by 3/4 inch area of abrasion. So essentially in this paragraph, it describes scratches on the nose as damage to the side of the nose, and the left cheek was swollen and bruised with additional bruising on top.
Situated on the right frontal scalp was a 2.5 by 1/2 inch area of edema and ovoid contusion with overlaying multiple small superficial lacerations, and an 1/8 of an inch depressed abraded laceration. On the left forehead was 1 5/8 inch by 1/8 of an inch abraded laceration. At the superior margin of this wound was a 1/2 inch abrasion. The anterior and posterior surfaces of the right ear were contused and overlaying linear scratches. The helix of the right ear was abraded. Situated on the right parietal scalp was an ovoid area of contusion with associated edema measuring 2 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch. Situated behind the right ear was an ovoid contusion with edema measuring 1 3/4 inch by 3/4 of an inch. Situated behind the right ear were multiple semilunar scratches. Situated on the left parietal scalp was a dovetail type laceration measuring 3/4 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch. At the inferior margin of the wound was an extension patterned contusion in the form of an upside down L. The vertical portion measured 1.5 inch and the horizontal portion measured 1/4 inch. Situated on the left temporal scalp was an abraded contusion measuring 1/8 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch. Situated on the right zygomatic region was a 4 by 3/4 of an inch contusion with overlaying punctate abrasion and a 3 by 16th by 1/2 inch abrasion. Superior to the wound extending on the right forehead region were 2 contusions measuring respectively by 1/4 by 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. Okay, so all that meant was the right side of the forehead and scalp had bruising, swelling, and small cuts. The left forehead had a larger cut with surrounding scrapes. Both ears were bruised and scratched, especially the right ear. And there were multiple bruises and cuts across the scalp, including the top and sides of the head, behind the ears, and the temple area. And some scratches were described as curved or crescent-shaped, which can sometimes be caused by fingernails. That's interesting. I actually never thought of that. So the severe skull and brain injuries is under the scalp, there was extensive bruising and swelling, showing significant trauma. There were multiple fractures, breaks in the skull in several areas. So the front sides and the top of the skull and the base of the skull. Many of these fractures were curved or semi-lunar, and some connected to each other, indicating the repeated or forceful impacts. The brain showed swelling, bleeding around the brain, bruising to areas controlling coordination and balance, cerebellum. What this means in plain terms, basically, is he suffered extensively and repeated trauma to the head, not just this one single injury. And it wasn't consistent either, right? The number and pattern of skull fractures strongly suggest multiple impacts or a very forceful assault, basically. The brain injuries alone would have been extremely serious and likely life-threatening. The binding marks show he was tied up while still alive. Object in his hand may suggest that he tried to grab or hold on to something during the attack. Presence of insects and environmental debris, along with the water-related skin changes, indicates his body was exposed outdoors and in water for some time.
Here's an interesting fact, and I didn't think of it this way until I read that post. But if you notice, 2 of the boys had very bad like the back skull injuries on the left side, but one had one on the right side. So they think that one person that killed the 2 boys was left-handed and the other one was right.
That is interesting.
Right?
Yeah. So, okay, hang on. I'm left-handed, so I'm just trying to think if I...
Whatever one they did on the left would be...
Yeah, so that is, yeah. Sorry, I was just envisioning, like, that's interesting. I would be curious to know what... if like Jason, Damien, and Jesse, if they're left or right-handed.
No, apparently someone else was left-handed. One of the parents, I forget.
Fucking Terry Hobbs.
One of the parents was left-handed, and then they don't know the right.
Subsequent autopsy of the head showed a multifocal, extensive subgullial contusion and edema. There were also multiple skull fractures, which are described as follows. Situated on the right posterior frontal skull bone was a 1 1/4 semi-lunar fracture. Situated immediately below this fracture was a similar semi-lunar circular fracture measuring 2 inches. Below this, on the lateral aspect, was a 1-inch fracture. Extending over the temporal scalp were 2 contiguous fractures. The most superior one measured 1 3/4 inch, and the intersecting semi-lunar inferior one measured 1 inch in length. Situated over the midline of the parietal scalp were 3 semi-lunar fractures, one of which became contiguous with the second, with an overall dimension of 2 inches. Inferior to this fracture was a similar semi-lunar fracture measuring 1 3/4 inches. Inch fracture involved the right anterior cranial fossa. A 3-inch fracture extended across the right posterior cranial fossa. The brain was edematous and showed subarachnoid hemorrhage involving the right cerebellar hemisphere. There were fractures, contusions involving the right posterior cerebellar hemispheres. So what this means is head and face injuries, right? So on the right side of the forehead or the scalp, there was a swollen bruise with several small cuts, including one slightly deeper cut. And on the left forehead, there was a larger cut with scraping, plus an additional smaller scrape above it. And then the right ear, front to back, was bruised and scratched, and part of the outer ear was scraped. And on the top and side of the head, on the right side, there were larger bruises and swelling. Behind the right ear, there was another bruise and several curved, like crescent-shaped scratches, which could also be the fingernails. On the left side of the scalp, there was a small but distinct cut. So a pattern bruise shaped somewhat like either, let's say, an upside down L or a backward 7. On the left temple, there was a bruised and scraped area. On the right cheekbone area, there was a large bruise with small scrapes on top, along with additional smaller bruises on the nearby forehead. And then what it means for the skull and brain injuries is under the scalp, there was extensive bruising and swelling, showing significant trauma. There were multiple fractures, breaks in the skull in several areas. So the front, the side, the top, and the base of the skull. Many of these fractures were curved and overlapping, which again suggests repeated impacts rather than a single blow. The brain showed swelling, bleeding around the brain, and injury to the cerebellum. Again, that's the area that controls balance and coordination. This was very much rage.
And if you can handle it in the Paradise Lost documentaries, you could kind of see a little bit of them too.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't recommend if you are is sensitive the right word. I don't know. They're very graphic. I mean, the opening scene alone is super graphic. So be prepared. I highly recommend everybody watch the documentaries. Just be prepared for that. It's not a lot. They're very graphic in short periods, I would say. Like the whole thing is not very graphic. It's a lot of like the trial and stuff like that. But they do show some photographs and the opening scene. I mean, if you need to skip it, skip it.
But like, just for based on this, like what you just read, like they show part of the face. So if you can't really picture the dimensions of it, like they show kind of an idea of what like would be on their forehead.
Yeah. Because I mean, what we're reading to you now, this is the autopsy report. So unless you have a good understanding of the medical terminology, it's hard to understand. I mean, I wish we had a better understanding of the medical terminology. And if there's anyone out there listening that does, let us know. We'd be happy to have you on to explain some of this. We just know that there is severe damage to their heads and faces.
Again, it looks like Michael suffered massive head injuries while he was alive due to the hemorrhaging. From the description of the wounds, it could have been a hammer or something similar that was used. He did have defense wounds on his hands. He was either trying to fight off his attacker or protect his head. Neck, chest, and abdominal injuries. In an area measuring 3 inches by 3/4 inch, situated over the right side of the neck and the scapula region, was an area of contusion with an overlying 1 1/4 by 1 1/2 inch abrasion. Situated medial to his contusion, extending onto the left side of the neck, was a 1 by 3/4 inch contusion. Situated on the right shoulder were 3 scattered contusions, measuring about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Adjacent to this was an area of focal red-purple contusion. Below this contusion, an area measuring 2 1/4 by 1/4 inch were multiple linear, diagonally oriented abrasions surrounded by contusions. These abrasions were interspaced by a distance of 1/8 to 1/4 inch. Situated on the lower right side of the chest were 2 3/4 inch contusions. Below this contusion were 2 parallel oriented abrasions which measured about 3/4 inch each and were interspaced by a distance of 1/8 inch. Situated over the lower left side of the abdomen were a group of linear abrasions which were interspaced by a distance of 1/16 by 1/8 inch. So basically, on the right side of the neck and shoulder blade area, there was a bruise with a scrape on top and another nearby bruise extending toward the left side of the neck. You could also see on the right shoulder, there were several small bruises and one larger bruised area. Below that were multiple thin parallel scratches, spaced evenly apart with bruising around them, suggesting contact with something patterned or repeated scraping. You could also see on the right side of the chest that there were bruises and two parallel scratches, again evenly spaced. Also, on the lower left abdomen, there were groups of thin parallel scratches close together. The lower extremities. A 1/4 inch ovoid contusion is present over the left knee. Binding abrasions were present on the ankles bilaterally. Situated above and below these binding abrasions were faint red-purple contusions. Back injuries. A 1-inch contusion was present on the back of the forearm. Situated over the right upper back were two diagonally oriented interrupted abrasions, each measuring about 4.5 inches. They were interspaced by a distance of 1/2 inch. Situated below this abrasion and on the left side was a 4 by 2 inch area of contusion. Below this contusion, extending to the right mid-back, were two linear, diagonally oriented abrasions, which were interspaced by a distance of 2/16 inches. Situated over the right buttocks were multiple linear scratches measuring from 1/2 inch to 3/8 inch. Punctate linear scratches were present on the inferior aspect of the left buttocks region. So you could essentially see a bruise that was presented on the back of the forearm. There was also on the upper back, there were two long diagonal scraped areas spaced slightly apart. Below that was a bruised area, and further down were more parallel scratches across the mid-back. You also could find on the buttocks, there were multiple small scratches on both sides. Upper extremity injuries. The wrist showed binding abrasions. Situated around these abrasions were contusions. Situated on the left antecubital fossa was 1/8 inch abrasion. Below this were linear abrasions measuring from 1/16 inch to 1/2 inch.
Situated in the right thenar eminence was a 1-inch cut. Situated on the left thenar eminence was a 1/8 inch superficial laceration. Situated on the back of the left hand was a 3/4 inch scratch and a 1/16 inch abrasion, which was present on the anterior surface of the left thumb. The hands showed bilateral washerwoman wrinkling. So the wrists showed clear binding injuries with scrapes and surrounding bruising. On the left side of the elbow, there were small scrapes and additional thin scratches below it. On the palms, base of the thumbs, the right hand had a larger cut. The left hand had a small cut, and the back of the left hand and thumb also had minor scrapes. Evidence of drowning. The hands and feet showed washerwoman wrinkling. The sphenoid sinus contained 2 milliliters of bloody fluid. Petechial hemorrhages were present on the epicardium, pleura, and thymus. The lungs were edematose and extruded abundant amounts of frothy material. The hands and feet were wrinkled, again, so consistent with being in the water for some time. A small amount of bloody fluid was found in a sinus cavity. There were tiny hemorrhages, so small burst blood vessels in areas around the heart and lungs. And the lungs were swollen and released a large amount of foamy fluid, which is a classic sign of drowning. So the opinion is the 8-year-old white male, James Michael Moore, died of multiple injuries with drowning. Investigation of the circumstances of death revealed the descendants was one of the 3 children that were found in a ditch which contained approximately 2 to 2.5 feet of water, approximately 150 yards southwest of Blue Beacon Truck Wash on the South Service Road at Interstate 40 and 55 West Memphis, Arkansas. The descendant was reported missing at approximately 6 p.m. on May 5th, 1993, and his nude body was found the afternoon of May 6, 1993. When found, the body was nude and the wrists were bound to the ankles bilaterally. Autopsy showed the descendant's hands were bound to his feet in a hogtied fashion. There were multiple traumatic injuries consisting of contusions, abrasions, and lacerations involving the head, torso, and extremities. The skull showed multiple fractures with associated brain injury. Defense-type injuries consisting of cuts were present on the hands. The anus was dilated and contained mud. Spermatozoa were not detected in the oral or anal smears. In addition, there was evidence of drowning, which included washerwoman wrinkling of the hands, pulmonary edema and congestion, aspiration of water into the sphenoid, sinus, and petechial hemorrhages involving the heart, lung, and thymus. The alcohol detected is probably the result of decomposition. No drugs were identified in the body fluids. Manner of death, homicide. So what this means is there were extensive injuries basically across the entire body, including the head, torso, back, arms, and legs. The pattern of bruises, cuts, and scratches suggests multiple impacts and contact with surfaces or objects, so not just a single attack. The binding injuries clearly show that he was tied at the wrists and ankles. The head injuries and skull fractures indicate severe trauma that would have been life-threatening. The findings in the lungs and body show that drowning also played a role, meaning he was likely breathing when he went into the water. So this one is the one that people say he was castrated. Some say it's animal predation. This is that one. So heads up for that.
Name, Christopher Mark Byers. Age, 8 years. Race, white. Sex, male. Cause of death, multiple injuries. Manner of death, homicide. External description. The body was that of a well-developed, well-nourished, nude white male. The hands were bound to the feet in hog-tied fashion. The fingernails were short and intact, with dirty beds. The body was covered with dried mud, leaves, and debris. There were multiple injuries situated on the body, which are described further below in detail. The body weighed 52 pounds and was 48 inches in height and appeared compatible with the reported age of 8 years. The body was cold. Rigor was present and fixed to an equal degree in all extremities. The body was pale with minimal posterior fixed lividity. After death, blood settles in the lowest part of the body due to gravity, causing purple or reddish discoloration in those areas. There was minimal amount of this on the back of the body. The scalp was brown, wavy, and blood-soiled. A 3/4 inch old scar was present on the right forehead, and a 1/4 inch old scar was present adjacent to the bridge of the nose. An old hypopigmented scar was present on the front of the chest. The irises were brown. The cornea was cloudy. The sclerae and the conjunctiva were slightly congested with no petechial hemorrhages. The teeth were natural and in good condition. The neck, chest, and abdomen were unremarkable, except for the injuries to be described. There were injuries noted to the anal genital area, which are described below in detail. The upper and lower extremities show no abnormalities except for the injuries and binding to be described further below. The lower extremities show the presence of a few old healed scars. Abundant amount of feces was present around the anus. So essentially, a large amount of feces was present around the anus, which can happen after death when muscles relax. Description of injuries. The boy was received nude and was covered with dry mud, leaves, and debris. There was washerwoman wrinkling of the hands and feet. The hands were bound to the ankles behind the back in a hog-tied fashion. Strands of hair-like material were found on the left posterior thigh and under the bindings of the left ankle. The right wrist was bound to the right ankle with a black shoelace, and the left wrist was bound to the left ankle with a white shoelace.
It's all the shoelaces used to bind the boys were from their own shoelaces, right? So, and it's not known which shoelaces belong to which shoes, unfortunately, especially due to the fact that there was a hair that was found in one of them that belonged to Terry Hobbs, which is one of the boys' stepfathers. So it's unfortunate that we don't know exactly which shoelaces went with which shoes. So head injuries, the right ear was abraded and contused. The inferior aspect of the right ear showed multiple linear abrasions measuring a half inch to 1 1/4 inch. On the bridge of the nose were multiple abrasions. Situated between the nose and the upper lip was a semi-lunar abrasion measuring about 1/8 of an inch. A 1/4 inch abrasion was present at the lateral aspect of the lower lips. A 1/8 abrasion was present on the midline of the lips. The mucosal surface of the lower lip showed a 5/16 inch laceration. The frenulum was contused and was surrounded by a 1/2 contusion. Multiple superficial bite marks were present on the mucosal surface of the right and left cheeks. So again, the right ear was bruised and scraped with multiple scratches underneath. The nose and area around the mouth had several scrapes and small cuts. His lips and the inside of his mouth were injured. There were cuts and bruising. The tissue connecting the lip to the gum, which is the frenulum, was bruised. There were bite marks inside of the cheeks, likely caused during trauma. So basically, he chewed on or bit the inside of his mouth, which is so sad. A 3/16 inch laceration was present above the upper lip. Situated on the superior aspect of the bridge of the nose was a 3/16 inch abrasion. Situated above the left eyebrow were two abrasions measuring respectively 1 inch and 3/4 inch. Situated on the right eyelid was a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch contusion. Adjacent to the medial aspect of the left eye was a 1/8 inch abrasion. A 1/8 inch abrasion was present adjacent to the lateral aspects of the left eyebrow. Situated on the left zygomatic region were two circular abrasions, each measuring 3/16 of an inch. Below these was a 1/4 inch by 1/8 inch abrasion. The left ear was contused and situated behind it were 5 linear abrasions, measuring respectively 1/2 inch, 7/16 inch, a 1/2 inch, 7/16 inch, and a 3/4 inch. A 1/8 inch abrasion was present on the helix of the left ear. In front of the left ear were 5 haphazardly orientated abrasions measuring 5/16 of an inch to 1/3 of an inch. So there were multiple scrapes and bruises around both eyes and eyebrows. The left side of the face and ear had several scratches and bruises, including behind the ear. There was a cut on the left side of the scalp with bleeding underneath the skin, showing it happened when he was alive. Situated on the left parietal scalp was a 1 1/4 inch laceration. Reflection of the scalp showed hemorrhage in the soft tissue underlying the laceration. There were multifocal subgaleal contusions with associated edema.
There were no fractures noted to the calivarium. However, the base of the skull shows multiple fractures. In the left posterior cranial fossa was a fracture measuring 3.5 inches in length. Extending from this fracture were multiple radiating fractures, which involved the entire posterior left cranial fossa. Situated on the left posterior medial cranial fossa was a 1/4 inch ovoid punched out fracture. A 1-inch fracture also involved the left middle cranial fossa. This punched out fracture means he was hit so hard that the punched out a section of his skull that went into his brain. This is another reason to suspect a hammer or something similar. The brain showed multifocal subarachnoid hemorrhage involving the left posterior cerebral and cerebellar hemispheres. Associated fracture contusions were present. So, some of the skull and brain injuries are noted as there was no fractures on the top of the skull. However, there were multiple fractures at the base of the skull. including a large one and several smaller cracks spreading from it. The brain also showed bleeding around the brain, bruising to brain tissue, especially towards the back. These injuries are consistent with severe head trauma. Neck injuries. Situated on the left side of the neck were a few scattered abrasions. Genital and anal injuries. The anal orifice was markedly dilated. Examination of the rectal and anal mucosa showed them to be diffusely hyperemic and injected. There were no injuries present. This is not in the autopsy report, but according to Google, markedly dilated anal orifice. The anal opening is unusually wide or lax, with reduced sphincter tone. While often associated with sexual abuse, this can also be caused by chronic constipation, neurological conditions, or post-mortem changes. Diffusely hyperemic. The tissue is red, inflamed, and irritated, typically indicating increased blood flow due to injury. Injected. The rectal anal mucosa lining is filled with blood, often appearing swollen or irritated. Contextual interpretation. Forensic medical context. These findings, especially when occurring together, are often evaluated as signs of potential sexual abuse or trauma. Other potential causes. These signs can also result from non-abusive causes such as chronic constipation, also known as encopresis, medical procedures such as suppositories, or postmortem alterations. Remember, they also noted no semen or blood found.
Yeah, so basically everybody assumed because of what's written in the autopsy, which is exactly how the person conducting the autopsy saw it, but they assume, oh, that means that they were sodomized or sexually abused, right? But it's not necessarily the case, so that's just why we added the explanations here.
The skin of the penis, scrotal sac, and testes were missing. Large gaping defect measuring 2 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch. The shaft of the penis was present and measured 2 inches in length. The gaping defect was surrounded by multiple and extensive irregular punctate gouging type injuries measuring from 1/8 inch to 3/4 inch and had a depth of penetration of 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. Some of these wounds showed hemorrhage in the underlying soft tissue, others did not. In between the thighs there were multiple areas of yellow abrasions with skin slippage. The medical aspect of the left thigh showed a yellow abrasion. Essentially, the anus was significantly relaxed and opened, and there was redness inside, but no direct injuries to the tissue. The genital area, however, was severely damaged, and with missing skin and tissue, a large open wound, multiple irregular gouging type injuries around the area. Some of these injuries showed bleeding, which means they happened while he was alive, while others did not, suggesting some occurred after death. There was also scrapes and skin changes on the inner thighs and buttocks, along with additional cuts and bruises. Again, not in the autopsy report, but essentially the skin of the penis was removed, along with the scrotal sac and testes. So while yes, he was castrated, his penis was also skinned. To do this intentionally in the bayou by the killers would have been almost impossible. This is a very important detail when it comes to who committed these crimes.
So essentially his penis was degloved, right? This is something that some medical experts will say it would be next to impossible to do in the bayou, and which is why the animal predation theory comes in here, which, not being a medical expert, it's hard to say which is accurate. Personally, I think it's more likely it's an animal predation, just from my experience in the case, like listening to other people talk about the case that are experts and stuff. It seems more likely that it's animal predation. Situated on the posterior surface of the left buttocks was a 1/2 by 1/4 inch contusion and a 1 3/4 inch linear abrasion. Situated on the posterior surface of the right buttocks were two faint contusions, each measuring about a half inch by a half inch. The left buttocks showed 5 superficial cutting wounds measuring from a half inch to 2 1/8 inch. Situated on the right buttock region were multiple linear, superficial, interrupted cuts measuring from 3/16 to half inch and were interspersed by the distance of 1/8 inch. Scattered linear abrasions were present about the anal orifice. Injuries of right leg, situated in the right anterior thigh, was a 1 by 1/3/8 inch reddish contusion. Below this contusion was a patterned contusion consisting of 2 ovoid red-purple contusions, the superior one measuring 3/4 inch by 7/16 inch, and the inferior one measuring 3/4 inch by 1/1/8 inch. Extending from both of these contusions were the superior one measuring 5 3/16 inches and the inferior contusion measuring 4 1/2 inches. The interspace between these two linear contusions was about 3/4 inch. A 1/4 inch abrasion was present on the anterior surface of the right leg. The ankle showed evidence of yellow-red binding abrasions. On the left ankle below the binding abrasion was a 3/4 inch by half-inch abrasion. Situated over the posterior right thigh and leg were multiple scattered abrasions and contusions. A 2.5 by 2 3/4 inch contusion was present above the ligature binding site of the right ankle. Injuries to the left leg. A 1/4 inch abrasion was present on the right knee. Situated below the right knee were 3 red contusions measuring 3/4 inch, 1/4 inch, and a half inch. A 3/4 inch by 1 inch abrasion was present on the left ankle. The posterior surface of the left lower leg and ankle show confluent contusions. So basically, the right thigh had a bruise and a patterned set of bruises and lines, which may indicate contact with an object or surface. Is this the one you were talking about with the manhole?
Yes.
I wish we had more clear pictures that we could see. Like, I know that sounds morbid, but it would just be nice to be able to, I mean, not nice, but it would be helpful to be able to actually see it, right?
Yeah.
There were multiple scrapes and bruises on both legs, including behind the legs, and the ankles showed clear binding injuries with additional scrapes nearby. Back injuries, multiple scattered abrasions were situated over the upper back region.
Injuries of right arm. Scattered abrasions were present over the right arm and forearm. A yellow binding abrasion, which was not surrounded by contusion, was present on the right wrist. Injuries of left arm. Multiple scattered abrasions are present on the anteroposterior surfaces of the left arm. A binding abrasion was present on the left wrist, and a superior margin of this abrasion was a faint red-purple contusion. Here's the opinion. This 8-year-old white male, Christopher Byers, dies of multiple injuries. Investigation of the 3 circumstances of death revealed that the descendant was one of 3 children that were found in a ditch which contained approximately 2 to 2.5 feet of water, approximately 150 yards southwest of Blue Beacon Truck Wash, on the South Service Road at Interstate 40 and 55, West Memphis, Arkansas. The descendant was reported missing at approximately 6 p.m. on May 5, 1993, and his nude body was found the afternoon of May 6, 1993. When found, the body was nude and the wrists were bound to the ankles bilaterally. Autopsies demonstrated bindings of the hands and feet behind the back in a hog-tied fashion with shoelaces. There were multiple abrasions, contusions, and lacerations of the face, which resulted in hemorrhage and fracturing of the skull. The skin of the penis, scrotal sac, and testes were missing. Surrounding the perineum were multiple cutting wounds. The anus was dilated with hyperemic mucosa. There were no injuries present. Spermatozoa were not detected in the oral and anal smears. In addition, there were multiple and extensive contusions, abrasions, and lacerations involving the torso and extremities. No alcohol was detected. Carbamazepine was detected in subtherapeutic levels. Manner of death, homicide. There were minimal signs of drowning in Christopher, so little that the autopsy didn't state drowning as a cause of death, like he died due to head injury. So what this essentially means is Christopher was restrained, tied up, using shoelaces, and the marks showed that this happened while he was alive. He also had many injuries across his entire body, including the head, face, torso, and limbs. We can also see the head injuries and skull fractures show severe trauma that would have been very serious or fatal. His genital injuries are extensive, with signs that some occurred before death and some after, which is an important forensic distinction. The wrinkling of the skin shows he had been in water for a period of time. And overall, the findings show a combination of restraint, significant physical trauma, and environmental exposure. And it literally could take only half hour to 45 minutes for that water to start your wrinkling.
Yeah. This is the one, Christopher Byers is the one that had the degloving of the penis,
Right.
which we assume, which I truly thought was the animal predation. But if there are signs that that happened, that some of the injury happened prior to death, actually, no, that would definitely indicate that that's probably more likely the fact. So the penis was injured prior. Then he went in the water. There's going to be blood. There's going to be exposed wounds. So that's going to make it more likely that the animals would be attracted to that.
I think that animal predation is just a kind of like a cover up.
Oh, I actually don't think it is. I think because they were trying to say that it was done like whoever killed him or whatever, like did that. I think he was injured there for sure, like no doubt of that. But I think the actual degloving part was more likely to have happened by the animals. There was
No,
snap.
I know that. I mean, like, I think they were trying to use it as a cover up in the sense of not showing the true trauma that they get. Do you know what I mean? So, like, they blamed the degloving and that on the animals, which it could very well be, but it kind of makes it more focused on the animal versus an injury that actual happened.
Then yeah, somebody obviously did injure that. And then sure, maybe the animal came in after, whatever, but there was still injuries there to begin with.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. That's
Yeah.
what I mean is like if you took the animals away, because everyone's like, oh yeah, animals did this, animals did that, right? If you took the animals away, then you would see what actually occurred to them, like beyond the obvious of like a broken
Yeah.
skull, right? If you don't have those animals there, then you would see a whole different body compared to having the animals.
Yeah.
Whereas they put the animals on is where I find they do the cover up of it.
The only problem is, though, is without knowing what parts the animals did, if any, we won't know what happened to them, right?
Right, right. But I'm just saying, like,
Let's say that animals did the entire injury to his penis, then maybe it wasn't a sexual in nature, like the attack wasn't sexual in nature at all. Versus if the animals did some, but the killer did some, then it is a sexual attack, right? That's where it's hard. Like if we knew for sure either way, then it would be easier to know what the attack was. But I think,
yeah, because I read another theory that someone had a truck at the truck wash that they put him in, right? But
I
watching that,
actually,
but watching that video, the way the truck wash is going compared to like where that thing is, I'm like, I think it would be a little bit harder,
yeah,
right? Because
it's,
you had to drive into the truck wash. It wasn't like it was off on the side. You kind of came into a parking lot and went. It
yeah,
was like a drive-in around. Because I even said for the restaurant, for me, when they say that the employees talked to this cop, but the cop never got out of their car or anything, I was like, how does that work? Did she go
right?
through the drive-through?
Yep,
So when he showed the video, right, it looks like a normal restaurant.
yeah. But and it was a normal restaurant with a drive-through.
Right? But I was just like, to me, it was just like, where is this coming from?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like, it's just messed.
it is.
All three boys were viciously attacked, and due to the severity of the injuries, if they were attacked somewhere else and then brought to the water, there isn't a lot of time before they would have died from other injuries. So it's more likely they were killed where they were found.
Yeah, so it's so tough to say because you get the evidence from the lack of mosquito bites that could say they were found somewhere else, right? But then the fact that the two boys did die from drowning, their injuries, there wouldn't have been a lot of time. But on the other side of that, the Blue Beacon truck wash is right there. So in theory, if you had like a semi truck trailer, you could have taken these boys into that trailer, murdered them, and then got them into the drainage ditch pretty quickly because it was close by. So like 5, 10 minutes maybe at most. It's something that I always wondered if that was part of the way they were tied up to make it easier for the person to carry them. I don't know.
I'll let you know how the tying goes on Wednesday.
Right? Yeah, there's a lot of theories in this case, and there's a lot of things that you could have, you can envision that this could be how it was done, or this could have been where it was done, or whatever. And then some of the evidence lines up with that, and then others don't. But then the evidence doesn't align up with with the other theories. So this is a tricky one. There's lots going on here.
Well, and I've read a lot too, but like about how they were tied,
Yeah.
right? It says a lot how they do, and they think that it's someone that's knows what they're doing.
Yeah, and I would really find it hard to see that Damien, Jason, or Jesse could have done those difficult knots. But on the other side of that, so even though they were tied, each boy was tied left ankle to left wrist, right ankle to right wrist. Their knots were different. So we will get into that because that's kind of an important part too. But I think this one was pretty heavy and it was very difficult to say all those words. And please be understanding. If we did not pronounce any of those words right, we're sorry. We tried. We really did. They were difficult. And so, yeah, we're not medical professionals. We don't have any training in that. So, I mean, it is what it is. We did our best. So, yeah, so we'll end it there. So that's it for Moms on Mics this week.
Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Moms on Mics Podcast, on TikTok at Moms on Mics, and join our Facebook group, Moms on Mics.
If anyone has any topics you would like us to cover, or if you have any questions or suggestions, you can email us at momsonmics@gmail.com or submit through our website, momsonmics.com.
We would also appreciate it if you could rate and review us on whatever platform you're listening on. It really helps the podcast move up on their charts so it gets more exposure. Hope you join us again next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.